A week on from the government's fifth budget, which was billed as a generational reset, is now a full-blown political gutter fight.
Surely there's some metaphor here.
They're taking out Albo's rubbish.
The rubbish dump, the bin fire that is this budget.
And there's more than a whiff of outrage over plans to replace the 50% capital gains tax discount on all assets, including shares and businesses, with an indexation system and 30% minimum tax on gains.
This government doesn't understand that the centrepiece, right at the heart of every community, is the small businesses that support the community. And these people are working harder than ever for less. And now the government's going to slug them with a whole lot more.
Leaving the government to fight a rearguard action against charges its reforms will crush risk-taking and entrepreneurial spirit.
Is this for one?
The Treasurer pointing out that businesses with revenue below $2 million would be exempt.
Small businesses receive somewhere between half and a full concession in the capital gains tax system. So they're not being changed. I've seen some misinformation about that.
While the government is downplaying the impact of its new taxes on assets and wealth, this year's budget looks to have broken the mould of recent years. Typically, media and public interest has tended to evaporate within a few days of the Treasurer's speech. Not in 2026, with a viral online debate and negative reactions in polls keeping the heat on the government. Today, a former senior advisor to Kevin Rudd warned the CGT switch will hurt the economy and productivity. Entrepreneur Lachlan Harris said the changes will make it harder for young Australians to start businesses. And he's not alone in worrying about unintended consequences for young people.
They now are going to be hit with a headwind of more tax on those savings, which is going to put them in a disadvantaged position when they turn up and try and put down their smaller deposit for a new home.
It's not unusual when you're making important changes to the tax system, reforming the tax system, that there'd be some consultation on implementation, and that's what we're engaged in.
To counter fears of a growing backlash, the government has released Treasury modelling that claims the change in tax on investments for most Australians will be moderate, lifting the average tax on gross capital gains from 19.3% to 21.4% in a decade.
When a capital gains occurs, it's looked at the real gains, that is the gains less inflation as we go forward. And that's a system that operated effectively between 1985 to 1999.
The government still has more work to do, convincing voters the budget will deliver what it says on the tin, a less distorted tax system that helps younger Australians. Critics may be running out of time to change the government's mind.
The first legislation we'll have will be in a couple of weeks' time when Parliament sits.
Senator Katy Gallagher is the Finance Minister. Katy Gallagher, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks for having me on.
The government's facing a considerable backlash over your proposed changes to capital gains tax. Can you first clarify which businesses will be subject to this new regime?
Well, the changes to capital gains tax are broad-based, so they're across all assets. And, you know, the reason we're doing this, if I can start really with the approach the budget's taken, it's doing a number of things. One, we're trying to rebalance the tax system that allows us to give tax cuts to 13 million working Australians, reform the capital gains tax so it returns to its original scheme, which is taxing real gains, reforming negative gearing so that we can get more young people into housing and deal with the housing shortage and some of the intersections between housing policy and tax policy. But we're also looking at how we can support, you know, small business. There's $3.5 billion worth of tax measures in this budget to ensure that we are supporting small business as well. But the overarching message is we're trying to essentially, you know, bring back into a more fairer way a balance between the tax arrangements on your wage income and tax arrangements as they exist for other assets.
Yes, and I appreciate we're going to talk about the fact that you've included shares and other non-property assets in these changes, but I want to stay with where the principal backlash is, which is around what this will do to businesses in Australia. So I understand that small businesses, those businesses who generate revenue under $2 million a year, are exempt from these changes. But most of the business activity in Australia is generated in bigger companies, those companies over $2 million in revenue. Is your new policy a disincentive for those businesses to grow?
Absolutely not. And I just outlined we had $3.5 billion worth of tax measures to support the growth and investment in our small business community. And 90% of small businesses, in relation to some of the concerns that have been raised, particularly in relation to trusts and how they are managed, would not be affected. The existing generous arrangements around capital gains tax for most small businesses, again, won't be affected. And so I think there is a level of misinformation around how some of these changes will impact, and that's over to us to explain that. But I think the changes overall really are about better aligning, as I said, wage income and the tax arrangements there with other assets and the taxation of those across the economy.
Now, you have accepted already, and it's written into the budget papers, that you are consulting with the tech and startup sectors. But why is a tech company any different from another business trying to grow in Australia?
Well, they have some unique arrangements, particularly as startups having a very low cost base or, low cost associated with their establishment. So we want to understand the impact of that a little bit more in consultation with them, and we've been clear to them about that. We've been clear in the budget papers, and those discussions really couldn't, be, I guess, finalised or, reach a final conclusion, but until the budget was released. We have agreed to do that.
Let me just come in there, because I'm not sure that makes sense that you couldn't have those discussions beforehand, but you haven't described why you should do a carve out for one particular sector. There are lots of businesses in Australia that have very low capital when they start up. So why create a two-tier, or at least a two-tier system where one section of business activity gets treated better than the others?
Well, I mean, that's not what I'm saying, Sarah. What we've outlined in the budget is that we want to talk further with that sector about some unique features of their industry, and I think that's a responsible thing to do. We had some of those, or the Treasurer had some of those discussions earlier, but those can, proceed now with the arrangements that we've outlined in the budget.
Well, what you haven't outlined, however, is why they are different. Why do they specifically deserve to be carved out? It's always messy when you carve out one sector of business activity. Why is it that the tech sector and the startup sector is so different that it deserves a better or different tax treatment than other parts of the business economy?
Well, the government hasn't taken a position on carve-outs. What we've said is we want to work with that sector to understand a little bit more about the concerns they are raising, and it's particularly about some of the costs that they, the way that their business is structured, particularly when they start, when they're early, young businesses, that we want to work through that with them further, and the Treasurer has, undertaken to do that, and it's clear in the budget papers.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is what's the difference between another business, say a medical research company that has low capital costs at the beginning. But let me put the question to you in a different way. Former Rudd government advisor Lachlan Harris says the changes you have made should be reversed and only apply to residential housing. Can you accept the advice of a friend to Labor that you should rethink these changes?
Well, part of the reason that we're trying to deal with these reforms and have put these reforms forward is to remove some of the distortions that we've seen in the way that the capital gains tax arrangements have operated. And in the, when you look at it over the last 20 years, you can see very clearly that it's overcompensated for investing in established properties, and that's have an impact on the housing market, which is another thing this budget seeks to do, is to rebalance that so young people get a fair go. And it's undercompensated in other areas. But if you were to and we're getting a lot of free advice at the moment, but, part of what we're trying to do here is remove distortions, not create new ones.
In the budget papers, Treasury says that the current capital gains tax doesn't tax high-growth businesses enough. Don't we want high-growth businesses to be incentivised and succeed in Australia, which doesn't come through higher taxing?
Well, we absolutely want to make sure high-growth businesses are successful in Australia. But what we are doing here is looking at how our tax arrangements work across the board. We think that, where we've got tax arrangements that treat working income, wage income, differently to how it's treated in other assets, that we should respond to that and make it a fairer, more neutral arrangement. And that's what we're seeking to do across the board. When you look at all of the reforms, negative gearing, capital gains tax, and some of the reforms that we've announced in relation to trusts.
There's a lot of people who were supportive of the idea of changes to capital gains tax as it relates particularly to housing, and I'm thinking here of some of the Teal independents who have very wealthy electorates, but they are asking you to ring-fence housing and pause on these other changes. Are you prepared to listen to that advice, to think about that, to reverse course?
Well, the decisions we've made are outlined in the budget, and we would be proceeding with those with legislation in the next, several sitting weeks. And again, I go back to my earlier answer, which is the changes we are making, we are seeking to ensure that people in relation to capital gains are taxed on their real gains, adjusted for inflation, and that we are removing the distortion that has existed in the tax system in this area for decades now, which has distorted the investment in fixed property or, established property, and returning that back to the original intention, which is to tax on real gains and to remove that distortion. And, some of the advice about you can only do it to this bit and not to that bit does not remove distortions in the tax system.
So first of all, to be clear, when will you bring these changes to the Parliament to be legislated? And would you accept the advice that you should take a pause and consider a Senate inquiry?
Well, there's been a Senate inquiry. There's a select committee that looked specifically into this issue. They have reported, that was chaired by Senator Nick McKim. There has been extensive opportunity for submissions and, the government obviously watched that inquiry. My understanding is that the legislation would be brought forward in the next sittings of the Parliament, and we would want to pass those bills as soon as reasonably able to. I mean, obviously it's got to go through both houses, and that will provide certainty to people going forward about the tax arrangements.
Katy Gallagher, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I appreciate you coming in. Thank you.
Thank you.